Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Nicholas Mosvik, and I am the Buckley Legacy Project Manager here at the National Review Institute. I am here with John O'Sullivan and Andrew Stuttaford, who will be joining us in a moment. And we are going to be talking this afternoon about Margaret Thatcher, William F. Buckley Jr., and their relationship and what we might call Atlantic conservatism. And the reason we are having this discussion when we are is we are just 4 days from Margaret Thatcher's 100th birthday. And we are just over a month out from Buckley's 100th birthday. So it makes perfect sense given their two centennials. And their long relationship is friends and leaders of relative conservative movements over the Atlantic to think about how it is that they work together to bring the success that they did, especially in winning the Cold War and the battle over ideas in the 1970s and 1980s. And then finally, to also talk about even after Thatcher's time as prime minister in the 1980s, her continued relationship with Bill in National Review and continuing the conversation on conservative ideas. So with that, I'm looking to see if Andrew's video is ready, if he's ready to join us. Otherwise, if he's not, John, you and I can also
Can
get
have a
the
conversation.
conversation started.
That's fine.
Yes, although the problem is then I want to start from the end as opposed to beginning, which I don't think is the
Okay.
natural place for these sorts of conversations to start.
Okay.
So maybe the better place to start is the beginning. And in this case, the first time that Thatcher and Bill really had a conversation where that friendship started, which is, in my understanding, an appearance on Firing Line in 1975 when Thatcher was still the leader of the opposition, years before she was elevated to prime minister.
That's right. Yes. I mean, and that led that was a good occasion from a conservative standpoint because it confirmed our view of how things happen. Andrew, hello. How are you? Welcome. Um, oh, I can't hear you at the moment. You're talking dumb show to me. But okay, let me just carry on with this point while your microphone starts to work. Because it was a
Hello.
mistake by Bill. You're a godboard. It was a mistake made by Bill that led to their friendship in a way. Mrs. Thatcher, had been speaking about a parliamentary bill, and he was at that point perhaps not paying enough attention. But anyway, he thought she'd addressed him as Bill, and so in the bread and butter note that he sent her, thanking her for her appearance, he addressed her as Dear Margaret. Well, he got a reply that began, Dear Mr. Buckley. He went back, played the tape to make sure that he hadn't misunderstood. And when he realized what had happened, it was been a simple mishearing on his part, he wrote her a letter of apology. And of course, that led to, of course, as often happens in these occasions, to a warmer friendship than might have existed without that. Um, of course, there were other reasons for that friendship, which obviously we will discuss, but they were already closely aligned. She knew about his work. And after all, at this point, it was 20 years since National Review had been founded. And people in Britain who were politically aware had become aware of National Review in the early 60s, about the time of the Goldwater campaign. So she would have been well aware of this. And of course, I think sometime in the late 60s, she had already spent a long visit to America, courtesy of the American taxpayer and the State Department, in which she spent quite a long time there, seeing America and in general being enormously impressed by the vitality and the sheer industrial and economic power of the country. She liked America before that, but she was now impressed with America. And that led, of course, I think quite naturally, to a wish to be closely allied to America as well.
Sorry, Andrew, if you came in a little bit behind there, we were starting with the beginning. So we're going back to the first time that Bill, Buckley, and Margaret Thatcher really had a conversation on firing line, and John was going through this story that Bill related in a column, and then I think actually also in his book on firing line in 1988, which is his mistake because he said he was always formal, always liked formality, but in this case, because he misheard, he thought it was okay to refer to Mrs. Thatcher as Margaret. So we were starting there to try to build how we even get to this point of this long-term friendship and relationship between the
I
two.
mean, and Margaret Thatcher, and John, of course, knows this aspect far better than I, although I was not enough to attend some National Review events where Mrs. Thatcher, as I always call her, Mrs. Thatcher, not Lady Thatcher. She's always
I
Mrs.
did.
T, basically. Um,
Or Prime Minister. She
or
asked me to
Prime
come
Minister, or
up
Prime
at a
Minister.
certain stage in our relationship, but I felt I don't want to do that. You're the Prime Minister, and that was how I addressed her.
But she certainly wasn't pompous, but she liked the forms to be followed. And one of the and of course she was a great admirer and friend of Ronald Reagan. But when the US, um, liberated Grenada, um, which was a member of the Commonwealth, British Commonwealth, without mentioning to the UK that they were going to do this, that didn't go down well. She'd have said yes in a second, but
No, no, no. But it was repaired very briefly in a conversation she had. He rang her up. I mean, the Foreign Office was fundamentally very. I think. I think it dropped the ball because they didn't realize the Americans were serious about Grenada. The George Bush, who was in charge of planning the Grenada operation, took the view that look, they're not going to do anything here. We don't want to sort of give them an opportunity to get in the way of it. And the Foreign Office therefore said to Mrs. Thatcher, "Well, this is just one group of Marxist thugs killing another group of Marxist thugs," forgetting that there was about sort of 130,000 of the Queen's subjects who were in the, so to speak, under fire from both sides. So she, I think, was late to grasp the significance of what was happening. And I think she did make a serious error there. But he repaired it by ringing her up and saying, "Well, Margaret, I feel I should throw my hat into the hall before we go any further in this conversation to, kind of let you shoot at it, I think." But in fact, and she said, "Oh, well, there's no need for that." And then they got back fairly easily on good lines. But I do think an element in that, although she never admitted it, well, I think later on she did, very much later on, but at the time she never wanted to say to agree that it had been a mistake, that the Americans had done the right thing and we hadn't helped. And I think the palace, oddly enough, or interestingly enough, did take that view. Their view was right. The Americans have got in touch with the Governor General, Paul Scoon. He'd blessed the operation. As far as the palace was concerned, that's all well and good. The Queen's subjects are now in a much better situation, and the American, and all right, any breach of diplomatic courtesies was secondary to that, and then relations got back fairly quickly on good terms. I can't remember what National Review said at the time. I wasn't there, actually. I mean, it was that was a few
I remember what you said though, John. I know we're talking about Bill Buckley and Margaret Thatcher. We actually had dinner with Frank Johnson and my father,
Yes,
and
yes,
that just after the invasion had been announced, and you and I were on the
yeah.
American side, and
Yes.
Frank and my father were outraged by.
But there was a very interesting development, which was that the House of Lords had a debate. And in that debate on what had happened, most of the people Mrs. Thatcher thought of, people who were close to her in the Lords, were very much saying this was a necessary thing. The Americans have done the right thing. We should support it. And that was true of people on the Liberal benches as well as of the Tory benches. Secondly, Paul Johnson wrote a very, very strong article in the Liberal Observer saying that rescuing Grenada was an issue as obvious and clear, clearly the right thing to do, as obvious as fighting slavery, he said. And so, in a way, all the Thatcherites were on board. You and I were Thatcherites at the time, and I still am really. And
I still am myself.
that kind of led her to reassess things, I think. After all, I think de Gaulle was once told that by a minister that all his friends were against de Gaulle's policy, and he said simply, change your friends. Well, in this case, her friends changed Margaret, really.
Well, to clarify, I think Bill Buckley pretty much agreed with what you were quoting from, John, in terms of one of his columns on Grenada. The way he put it was, surely the salient point is that with minimum loss of life, we have rescued a little island in the Caribbean from a monstrous tyranny whose script was being written in Moscow and Havana, that we obliged the island's neighbors who were obviously targeted for subversion, and that we have the manifest gratitude not only of the American students, but of the population of Grenada. Isn't that the point, really?
Yes.
So
And yeah.
I think that one clarifies what National Review, or at least Bill's position was. But also, I think hopefully helps us to get a little bit more into the discussion of Thatcher and Buckley and the Cold War and the defense of the West.
Yeah. Well, you're quite right. And I would go a little further than Bill did on that occasion, because Bill, in a way, is responding to George Will, who said of the Grenada, he said, "Look, the celebration is overdone. What we have just achieved, not an exact quote, what we have just achieved is at best a small regional victory." But in fact, that wasn't how it was seen in Moscow, as I discovered when I was researching my book on Reagan, Thatcher, and Pope John Paul. They were faced with an embarrassing position. Their people, the people working for them, including, of course, some of the people in governments in the East Caribbean, were coming to Moscow and asking for help against this and against a more vigorous American policy. And Gorbachev's principal aide confides to his diary that I couldn't really give them any comfort because we simply don't have the resources anymore to give them what they want, and that's going to be and I felt embarrassed, and quite interesting to read, because I mean, this was a man who obviously thought he was, so to speak, on the right side of history, and he's lamenting the fact that we can't do anything. We'd like to. We feel bad. We feel we're letting our friends down, but we can't. And that I thought was an extremely that makes Grenada a more significant event, and indeed that was the view taken by dissidents like Vladimir Bukovsky, because, as he said to me, look, it's the first time these so-and-sos have ever had to give something back, and they hate that. After all, if the unstoppable march of history is on your side, you shouldn't be losing anything.
Do you think, Nicholas? I mean, do interrupt me here, obviously. If you look at John, if you look at the Thatcher-Buckley relationship, I mean, anti-communism was an enormous unifying thing that the two shared. I mean, they were. I don't consider it an insult. They were Cold Warriors, and they didn't see it as they didn't agree on the march of history. They thought it could be stopped. How important do you think that was in their relationship, anti-communism? Was it the thing?
Yes, I do think it was important. In a way, anti-communism as a binding force in the West in general, but particularly in Anglo-America, it waxes and wanes depending on what's happening in the world. So that, for example, it's very important in the period from really from about 48 when people both governments really come to terms with the fact that they're in a Cold War for the long haul. And then you have this period in which both Brits and Americans really don't have much problem in agreeing on what needs to be done. Then you get to Vietnam, in which that kind of conviction has faltered. But you get it back again in the mid 70s when everything seems to be going wrong. And that's something that made National Review important to Margaret Thatcher. When Bill offered me the editorship, I mean, I was still in Downing Street, and I went to see him, and I said, I know you want me to stay because we were trying to complete a particular reform, but I have this opportunity. And she said right away when I told her what it was, "Oh, you've got to take this, John." She said, "This is a world historical opportunity." Well, I mean, I couldn't quite see myself in that role, but still, she saw right away how important it was, not for sectional British interests, as some suspicious anti-American, anti-Brits might think, but simply because we were going into we were in the middle of an 80 sorry, this was 86. We were in the middle of a struggle, which we were just about to win, actually. And she saw that to have for me to have a position in which I could, with some well, have at my elbow influence on how America, Britain, and the West generally would be moving to move into a post-Cold War world was a very important advantage. Anyway, we were on very good terms, and so she wanted something that was going to be good for me too. So I think that she, I mean, she knew Bill, she admired him, she knew that there were some differences. She didn't think they were important, not when you compared them with the struggle against the communists in the Cold War, and then the attempt to create a stable peace without the Soviet Empire descending into chaos and bloodshed. And we have to admit that's, well, I will not admit, I will proclaim that that is what they did. I mean, they managed to bring about the demise of the Soviet Empire, as she said of Reagan, without firing a shot. And I would say of them both, by sort of making sure that the interests of the Russian people in peace, and Gorbachev was attuned very much to that. Which they would work with Gorbachev and later with Yeltsin to make sure that those things that achievement happened and that it was bloodless. So I think she saw, and National Review did have, as George Will said, a consequential role in that, and therefore I was being given a great opportunity, which I was.
That's the apocryphal line, the uh, Bill Buckley won the Cold War because without Bill Buckley, without National Review, no Ronald
Yes.
Reagan, no end to the Cold War.
Yeah. No,
Um,
that's right.
no, that's a
That's
very interesting point, John, that makes me wonder, and Andrew, please chime in on this too, is a commonality between the two figures, between Thatcher and Bill, but also perhaps President Reagan, a certain disposition, an ecumenicalism. Often with Bill, that's attributed to fusionism, but without bringing in that, I think, somewhat loaded term, um, thinking about, like I say, the dispositionalism, this particular character that allowed them to see, as you pointed out, the more important mission and goals in mind. We can call that the defense of the West anti-communism, things of that nature. But is that a view or a virtue that was shared, and that's part of the explanation for both their relationship and success?
Over to you, Andrew. This is
Yeah, I mean in a way, you can't ignore the fusionism point, because Bill Buckley was very famous for saying, who do you vote for, the right-wing candidate most likely to win. And of course we had the fusionism, we had the three-legged stool, and he was, in that respect, he was very much a pragmatist. There's if you're in the foxhole, and you'll take any friend really. And Mrs. Thatcher, if you look back to the 70s or the 80s, so John, if you think back to people like Frank Chappell, people like that, he was a British trade unionist who was very anti-communist. He ran the electricians union, and she also believed that, I mean, neither Bill Buckley nor her were afraid of conflict, and perhaps they reshaped, in a sense, the right in their countries, which you wouldn't have done without conflict. But when it came to fighting communism, which they both saw as rightly as an existential threat and an evil, they would take anyone pretty much on board on that particular battle who was prepared to join in, basically, and more strength to them for that.
Yes. In fact, the right-wing trade union leaders, and actually the majority of their members, even in left-wing trade unions, were the equivalent of the neoconservatives joining conservatism in the 60s and 70s. And she had a much larger, so to speak, she had a much wider coalition in when she came in and as she progressed in government than the purely conservative one. There were a lot of working class people in it. There always have been some in the conservative ranks, but there were more, and many of these were members of trade unions, whereas previously a lot of the working class Tories were anti-union themselves. So yes, this was a significant widening of the Conservative coalition, very similar to what happened, as I say, when the upsurge of violence in American universities drove liberal professors into the open arms of the Republican Party, and particularly of Reagan. And that was something that was realized, I think, over in America, I mean, by, for example, George Meany and people like that, the leaders of the conservative, so to speak, socially and patriotically conservative leaders of labor unions. They were, as now under Trump, they became part of the conservative coalition, even if somewhat silent members, still holding Democratic Party cards, really. I mean, when I helped to start something called, when the Cold War was over, called the New Atlantic Initiative, and Lane Kirkland was one of the first people to sign up to it, and that was a movement to get the countries like Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and Poland into NATO and the EU, and so this was not a narrow movement. The anti-communism of the Cold War period and what I call the post-communism, post-communist patriotism of the later period was a significant factor. People now are talking about that period as if this was a small number of neocons who did this. Quite false. It was virtually the whole of the right at that point. And secondly, many people who were not on the right as well. This was an American movement, and it was understandable, because after all, that America had just won a great civilizational battle, and everyone was then worried about, if we do nothing, will Central and Eastern Europe descend into the chaos of the 1930s with extremism, anti-Semitism, and all of the border disputes and wars of the period and of that time, and creating a zone of stability was something which I think certainly Reagan, certainly, I think Bush, certainly Thatcher, certainly the Tories who followed her, all believed in that. And that's a significant fact about that period. We seem to have forgotten. We seem to have forgotten that worries about a zone of instability were solved by creating a genuine zone of stability, which only 2-3 years, it's only 3 years since a deliberate attempt to destroy that stability was launched.
Yeah, I think that's very true. A National Review, and obviously with John and with Bill, I say Bill, but Mr. Buckley presiding, was very much in favour of that. I know that because I wrote a few articles back in the day on this subject. One of my interests, what then and now, was the Baltic states, and the Baltic states, of course, were right on the edge of Russia, and there were a lot of concerns there. The Russian troops were still there until 1994, which is often forgotten, and that there was going to be big trouble. And there were little referendums and mini referendums and all this and all that. And I remember the early times of going to the Baltics, people would say, "Oh, very, very, very careful, Andrew, be careful there." And I realized it's because they had realized thought it was the Balkans, which were in very poor shape indeed. And famously, I think CNN from time to time would move the Balkans to the Baltic states, which caused immense irritation up there, I can tell you. And so the creation of this, we always forget. I think we forget with complacency. People who talk about the mad rush to the NATO expansion east, how dangerous it was, which it actually. Well, we were not here to talk about that, but let us just say that the nearest that we came to blows, NATO came to blows with Russia, was in Bosnia/Serbia, which was left in a grey zone, whereas there was never much question in the 90s anyway of any trouble in the Baltics or in Poland and so on and so forth. And,
Well,
I think Thatcher, I know Thatcher liked it, and I think Bill Buckley did too.
I'm inclined to think, yes, that's right. I'm inclined to think we overreached in that war, and we completely ignored the sovereignty of Serbia, and that was a mistake. I'm not saying we could have let the Milosevic government do anything it wanted, but the point is we should have taken the sovereignty of Serbia more seriously as an obstacle. But that was done by Clinton and Madeleine Albright, and I think that was a mistake. But let me discuss another point. The relationship between between Mrs. Thatcher and National Review and Bill became even closer, much so, and very greatly so, after she left office. Well, that's understandable in a way, because all of a sudden, she's no longer in office. She hasn't got 100 things to think about and do. In fact, that was a problem for her, because going from power to being a private citizen, still an MP, meant that she went from having what somebody said might be the cocaine rush of power to the feeling of being on an isolated beach with nothing to do. And so National Review, what we did was we approached her and got her agreement. And then we had a series, I think there were 9 in all, 9 conferences at which she was the chairman, and we took an issue and we invited the experts in that issue, and she chaired the conference on that. It would be one conference would be held in the US. Virginia was one, and another was the Maryland, and then the other would be one was in Bath in England, another was in Fiesole in Italy, and that there was an intense weekend of debate and argument, most of which got published, and that led to Mrs. Thatcher being one of the speakers at the conference on which, as you remembered, I think, Nicholas, it was the first. That's right. It was the first international conservative conference. I'm not completely sure that was accurate, but we thought it was. And it was a considerable success. And that was the work, of course, of NRI, which had been founded, oh, I suppose about 3 or 4 years. Yes.
91.
Yes,
91,
91,
yes,
just at
that's
the
right.
same time as Mrs. Thatcher was suddenly, on the deserted beach, wondering what to do next. And so that was, and that continued right until the end of the century, and was enormously helpful for us. We got the benefit of her companionship and ideas and arguments. And secondly, the people at the conferences really went away with a great deal, I think. And we have, maybe we should revisit that and go back and publish the papers. I mean, they were published here and there, but maybe we should publish them in one.
They were. I went to two, and they were not as a speaker, just as a sort of hanger-on,
Yeah.
and they were very high-powered. And the Thatchers, Dennis Thatcher came too, were always very good sports and always would talk to everyone, all the guests and all the rest, late into the night. But by the first of these, I was wondering, goodness, what is this going to be? And I'd been sat next to Dennis Thatcher, and it was lunch. And he said, well, this is going to be quite an event, young man, sort of thing. And I said, yes, I think so. And he said, so what are you speaking about? But I said, well, I'm really sort of a hanger-on here. And he said, well, you and I better stick together because there's a lot of very clever people here. Very clever. and so indeed we did. And they were, and it was all part of the cementing of the Anglo-American sort of friendship on the right, if you like.
And of course that led, as I say, to the International Conservative Conference, which was quite successful. And all of that was the work of NRI, which of course had not existed when I joined National Review, but was the work of a lot of some very, very fine people. The then publisher, who no longer with us, alas, he was very much involved and an early supporter of it. And I think my good friends to this day, Gay and Stanley Gaines, who I think will both be at the forthcoming dinner in Palm Beach for NRI. That they played a major part. So did the man who was later, I think, the publisher, Dusty Rhodes. He and his wife were very much involved and behind all of that. I remember that as being a very, very exciting time. Of course, we had just won the Cold War, and a great deal seemed open to us and was. And I think, well, this is really your field, Andrew, but let me put it this way. The idea that Reagan and Thatcher are responsible for the policies that were followed 25 and 30 years later generally by governments of the other party is completely ridiculous. What followed their period in government was a period in which two things were joined. One was there was a period of peace, which we perhaps took too much for granted, the holiday from history, but the other was that the economy had a 20-year boom, 25 more like it. And some of the consequences of that were new problems we hadn't had before, and which we took some time to become aware of. But we must. But they were that period is one of the great periods of history. The French call the 30 years between 1945 and 1975 the 30 glorious years, and they were the result, of course, of America having well, producing at the start of that period about 50% of the world's GDP, and that meant that the Western world really was going to win almost whatever happened.
Can I have you guys for the next 5 minutes to use that what you just talked about, John, as the next thing to talk about, I think would be a great idea. And then we can move on to Q&A. And so I would ask, we have one question so far, but please bring in a couple more if anyone has them. But what I meant, John, is you mentioned the economic boom. And what I wanted to get to, if we can, is Bill and Margaret's second conversation, or I'm sorry, Mrs. Thatcher, Prime Minister, 1977, once again, before she was Prime Minister, when she was still leader of the opposition, was on, I believe the title of the program was The Failures of British Socialism. So this is getting, I think, both to not only an important thing they had in common, right, beyond just the Cold War and anti-communism, but also a subject that they returned to in the 1990s. John, you mentioned this international conference and what Mrs. Thatcher was doing with National Review Institute, that focus being on what defines a free society. If we can put it broadly, I think. And so going back to that second conversation on firing line, I think there's a really important theme there that I'd like you both to touch on before we turn to question and answer.
Well, would you like to kick off, Andrew, and I'll follow up?
Certainly. I mean, I mean, where they both agreed was, I mean, you know, what we were seeing in formation was and tightened in was the Anglosphere, and at least in its first incarnations, it was defined in many ways, apart from anti-communism and then if you like, the celebration of that and construction of the new, I'm not going to say New World Order, but I just did. But also it was of the free market economics. And, you know, you can talk all you want about theory X and theory Y and theory Z, but if it doesn't work in practice and pretty quickly, you're going to have a very difficult conversation. And what happened with both Thatcher and Reagan, and certainly with Bill Buckley supporting it and bringing names, helping bringing names like Hayek and Friedman into popular discussion. You had the for a generation that had been brought up in America, for example, on Paul Samuson's view of economics, and the or in Britain, the inevitability of Keynesianism, and in Britain in particular, sort of stumbled into shambles. And thought, but there was no alternative. And what Mrs. Thatcher famously said, well, there is no alternative, and that alternative is that we move away from all this. So you had this incredibly creative interchange, in which Bill Buckley played a very important part by providing a platform for these ideas of which once upon a time, because these were not new ideas. Hayek was writing in, you know, he wrote The Road to Serfdom in 1944. Friedman had been at it for years. But what Buckley did was provide a platform for these sort of ideas to be heard and to point out how they were doing well. And this was echoed across the Atlantic by Mrs. Thatcher and the Conservative Party, who were watching Reagan, who when he was elected, certainly not by me or John, but he was regarded with a lot of sort of patronizing. What does this man know? And then within 2 years, you had Paul Volcker, you had Reagan, you had this self-evident beginnings of a major boom. And I think that what Thatcher did it, but also some of her sort of psychic is absolutely the wrong word to use for Nigel Lawson, her finance minister, but people like that, but also a series of think tanks. And in Britain, such as the IEA, John knows very well, CBS. In America, You had the think tanks as well, of course, but you also had National Review as a platform for these sort of views, giving people chance to make themselves heard. In a way, in some ways, journalistically in the UK, there was less equivalent to that. The Economist here and there were bits and pieces, but here you had Bill Buckley at National Review saying, free markets are the thing, and they work, and giving people a platform. Very important, I think.
Yes, she believed in free markets, obviously, but she didn't just believe in that aspect of things. She believed too in fiscal and financial responsibility. I mean, she was well aware that a free market system delivers punishments to governments which actually inflate they're trying to inflate their way out of trouble. And she didn't want to encourage anything like that. So she was very much in favor of reducing taxation. And particularly in the Lawson budget of 88, I think, she cut income tax considerably. But she would always say that she had created the circumstances in which she could cut income tax without having to borrow in the future. They had accumulated surpluses and so on. And indeed, the last few years of the Tory government, of that Conservative government, were periods in which we paid down our national debt considerably. She believed in privatization. When you asked her a wider situation, she would say, however, very clearly, of course, I believe in liberty, very much so, but I believe in liberty under the law. It's very Burkean that she did not believe in unrestrained license. She wanted to have firm or clear authority, and as well as a government that would actually make people freer, allow freedom of speech, encourage freedom of speech, for example. Now, the left, to give the left its credit in Britain in the 80s, they did see a lot of this. And they were the first people to define what Thatcherism was. And although I don't think their definition is quite right, it is in fact quite a clever definition. They said Thatcherism was free economy, strong state. The state was limited and smaller, but strong. It possessed real authority. That's why, for example, the miners' strike was so important. The miners' strike challenged the authority of the democratic government. It wasn't just a strike for higher wages or better conditions, and it didn't have the support of most miners in Britain either. It was a strike to try to bring about socialism against the election of a conservative government. And she won that. She yielded in 1981 to the first one because she didn't have the ability to fight it. But she then immediately set about preparing for the next miners' strike, which she knew would come, and it came. So the miners' strike was as important as the Falklands War in foreign policy in establishing her authority and the authority of democratic constitutional government in Britain, beyond all doubt, and for the rest of her time as Prime Minister. Now, she also applied that after the Cold War. When she was talking to the Russians, I was slightly involved in this, but she set up a foundation. And that foundation was particularly interested in helping what was happening, helping to establish democratic societies in the old Soviet bloc. And in fact, in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Hungary, that was successfully done. They're all much richer countries. The Poles may be richer than Britain at the moment. And certainly Václav Klaus, one of her, well, I think he was probably her favorite prime minister in the Eastern Bloc. They carried out Thatcherite policies, and with great success. I mean, I live in Hungary now a lot of the time, and I can tell you it's completely changed from what it was when I first came here under the communists in 71 and later, immediately after they'd lost power. Um, but again, she stressed here, liberty, yes, but liberty under the law, because that's the only way that you will be able to be sure that the liberty continues. If the habit of law and accepting the decisions of courts takes root in a society, it will influence the government as well as it will influence the people. And so she was very much a kind of, let me put it this way, she would have agreed with Viktor Frankl when he was given the copy of the Statue of Liberty. He said, "I'm delighted to accept the Statue of Liberty on the East Coast. I only wish there was also a statue of personal responsibility on the West Coast." And that's exactly her view.
I think that's a great place to turn to our questions because we do have one, and it touches on some of what you're going over, John, which I think was great in terms of content about ordered liberty, as we might call it, or liberty but not license, which is very important, as you said, Burkean concept. So the question we got was regarding the state of free speech in the UK at the moment. It made particular reference to the arrest of the comedian Gran Lennon, I believe is
Yeah,
his name,
yeah,
for online jokes or I actually think statements about transgenderism, as I recall.
yeah, yeah, sure.
I think they're actually pretty anodyne statements.
I agree.
The arrest was under the Public Order Act, which our questioner mentioned was signed into law by Margaret Thatcher. But I think this actually ties in very well to what you're pointing out, John, in terms of
Mm,
public order itself being a very important concept
mm,
for 20th century conservatives, including neoconservatives like Walter Burns, who talked about the problem of public order and
mm,
freedom of speech, that is properly defined freedom of speech, not licentiousness or license, but
yeah.
one subject to public order. So I think that's actually a great place for you to kind of talk about both what that meant, but where we are at the moment, right? In other words, did we get to this point in the UK with free speech? Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not a result of that? Is it a result of that, or what else has gone on to bring us to that point?
Well, first of all, of course, I mentioned the miners' strike before, and the fact that the government, in fighting that, it took preparations to make sure it wouldn't be defeated. And one of those preparations, I mean, some of them were economic, making sure there would be a supply of coal available for industry. But the other was ensuring that that public order would be maintained, and that if people wanted to go to work, miners wanted to go to work, they would be able to do so. And that involved pitched battles, which the miners lost. I mean, it involved strengthening the police, making arrangements so that what were called mobile groups of striking miners wouldn't be able to go from pit to pit, stopping people going to work. That was a clear victory for the government, a clear victory. And now the Labour government is announcing that it will hold an inquiry into the policing in 40 years ago. They clearly are rankled by the fact that they were defeated in this, and they want to cast a shadow of illegality against it. This coincides, of course, with the situation in both Britain and America, in which there are large gangs, well, gangs is perhaps too strong, but large crowds who, by their actions, intimidate others. Some, as we've seen, some of these marches by the Palestinian support groups are manifestly intended to intimidate anybody, but in particular Jews, and the failure of the police to deal effectively with them, a failure which Home Secretaries have criticized, by the way, not simply tabloid newspapers. is extremely ominous, and in both countries, the left in power seems to be pretty tolerant of violence used by its own supporters. Of course, everyone at the moment is shocked by the Charlie Kirk's murder, and they should be, and let's hope that will give some people pause for second thoughts. But the left has been, in effect, since the George Floyd murder, it has been using violent Antifa demonstrators as their own red guards in the Cultural Revolution. And this really is something which I believe responsible Democrats are very worried about, but don't quite know how to bring it to an end, because many of the people doing these things are their supporters. Now, on the situation in free speech, there is no doubt that at the moment, the courts seem to have got it into their head. And it was, I think, put there in part by the Prime Minister in a speech he gave on television after the Southport murders, that it is more important to crack down on what you might call vigilantes, or people who are trying to who are taking action, sometimes unfortunately violent action, to prevent to protest, I mean, against crime and against the rape gangs and against other things which have been tolerated. The courts are more worried about what the ethnic British working class people who feel personally affronted and personally threatened by these kind of things. They're more anxious to regard them as the people who have to be corralled, kept down, warned against taking action, than they are the supposed to be more radical groups. And that's because the radical groups for some time in England now have had the kind of moral advantage, inexplicable to me, that because they're fighting for social justice, well, because they're protesting against the evils of slavery in the past, that we have an obligation not to be too worried about whatever excesses they carry out. And I think that is wrong and dangerous, and we now have to reverse it. It's difficult to see how it's going to be reversed for some time, because the Labour government won't want again to take too strong action against its own supporters. But that's a problem. On the question of free speech, it seems to me outrageous that some of the sentences which were given to people who are protesting online, which cannot be said to incite anybody. Incitement traditionally is, I say, there's the guy, let's go and get him. It's not sitting at a typewriter and writing something which may be prejudiced and even hateful, but nonetheless is not likely to be read by someone in a riot, and therefore, lead to a violent attack on someone. We have gone astray in a big way here, and we've got to learn people to accept they live in a society in which other people will say things that they don't like, that they fear, they think are hateful. If they are suffering from intimidation, which intimidation is when you feel that if you say anything out of line, this gang of people will beat you up. That's a different matter. I mean, I think we're right to crack down on that, but cracking down on solitary isolates sitting at typewriters in their pajamas and saying unpleasant things about other people, about other groups, that is something which in a free society you have to accept. And even if you don't want to accept it, you have to have a penalty that is in some way proportionate to the offense. Some of the people who've been sent to prison recently for writing things have said nothing very terrible. And they certainly have not committed any violence. They were sitting at typewriters. The woman, and the case of the wife of the Tory councillor who is now released, but she got a 3-year sentence. What's worrying about that is not just the penalty was excessive, which it was, but that she was really, in effect, frightened into pleading guilty and getting it over with. And I think that the idea, if the Prime Minister goes on television and says, we're going to crack hard down on this, and the courts are going to stay open at night to make sure we do so, and we're releasing violent criminals and sexual criminals from prison, in order to make room for people who are rioting in protest. I think that is quite wrong, excessive, and it has produced a really serious political crisis for the Labour government, because there's now a conviction among many people who would once have been Labour supporters that the government hates them. And while that is the case, it will be very hard for them to establish a more rational, cool, and peaceful situation. Don't you
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of ordered liberty, which rests on self-restraint, also assumes self-restraint by government. And that is no longer what we have or what we see. And I think if Buckley certainly understood this, Thatcher, I think, less so, or was less inclined to worry about this. It was the gnawing away of the institutions, the Long March, if you want to use that term, in Britain, where you have a left-ish judiciary, in some parts quite left. You have I'm in the legal profession by background. I still read all the stuff, and I'm still a solicitor. The legal profession has moved to the left. The police have moved to the left. Is there two-tier policing? Judging, in my view, without question. And why there is the hysterical reaction to online media and the grotesque sort of punishments which John has been talking about is that why they hated Mrs. Thatcher so much in her opposition years in the 70s and then again in the early 80s. She was saying things that people weren't meant to say. And so, you know, in Britain in particular, America has had a polyglot media culture. I mean, I remember my amazement at first hearing Rush Limbaugh all those years ago. Never possible in the UK. And so there has been an informational monopoly, broken down somewhat by cable. But now you have got all these voices on social media saying, hang on a second, this is absolute nonsense. And the authorities are appalled, and they understand the American legal concept, shall we say, of chilling effect. And when you arrest a housewife, and what she said was pretty bad, but it wasn't, as John says, it wasn't incitement. But there are countless cases.
And it wasn't as bad. Was it any worse than the Labour councillor?
No.
Who's going to slit the white throats of so and you know, basically the courts have treated that as well. That was, he shouldn't have said that, of course. Look, there are somebody that you can take a statement that is made in heat, in a row, in a bar, and you say, well, he shouldn't have said that, but you know, there wasn't, everybody was under control and so on. And then you might say the same statement when somebody is alone in a crowd of people who are hostile and you are directing it at them. That is a different kind of statement. And we have to take those things in mind, bear those things in mind. But the fact is that at the moment, huge sections of the British people feel that the government is against them. And that's never a healthy situation. And if they've got any sense, the Labour government will actually begin to amend not only its language, though that too, but also some of its policies.
Well, gentlemen, we're about at 3 o'clock. That is a pretty good place, I think, to wrap up, which is suffice to say, twofold concluding matter. Number one, it sounds like we need another Margaret Thatcher. So that might perhaps be the ending place. And that our current crisis, at least in the UK, is that blasphemy is being enforced, but against the wrong orthodoxy. It has been
Yeah.
essentially replaced, which is to say, to go back to that question, public order matters, but of course, order has to be defined properly by tradition and arguably certain metaphysical propositions, and we're no longer there. So
Yeah.
yes, perhaps that is our ending order is we need another Thatcher, and that would perhaps help to renew this Anglo conservatism that we are convened to discuss. With that, my thanks to both of you, to John O'Sullivan for your wisdom and Andrew for coming, and for everybody who came and participated and listened. Thank you for supporting National Review, National Review Institute, and I look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you very
Yeah.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
And
very much. Right.
yeah, thank you. Good talking to you, Andrew. See you soon, I hope.
See you
Nick,
soon, absolutely.
we'll have a chat soon. All the best.